So welcome to our next panel, Food Part 1 for MIGC, Nourish, Food, and Trust. This is our 18th annual conference, and I'm so glad that you're all able to join us here virtually today. And without further ado, we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, so I believe I'm going first here. Just give me one moment to share my screen. My name is Emma Nickelbine, and I'm a first-year PhD student in UW-Milwaukee's English department. My focus is Arboreal Humanities, which is basically the study of trees and our human relationship to them. So I will be sharing my latest work with you guys today. And basically it just gets into a very particular short film that just recently came out in 2009. And this film is only about 16 minutes long, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in here related to trees and land. And so I'm going to take just a moment to talk about that. So this paper represents part of a longer work about Black writers in the US and Africa telling arboreal stories and the connection of trees in those works to the collection and transmission of memories, both personal and communal. And the paper interacts with Christina Sharp's concept of wake work, which is from her book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being. Sharp seeks to highlight, quote, the ways our individual lives are always swept up in the wake, produced and determined, though not absolutely, by the afterlives of slavery. And she really shows that the past that is not past continuously reappears, always to rupture the present. Her goal really is to, quote, make wake work art analytic and continue to imagine new ways to live in the wake of slavery, in slavery's afterlives, and to survive and more in the afterlife of property, end quote. So Sharp's concept of wake work is really useful in my discussion of trees and memory because it includes a key element of telling stories and bearing witness to the stories of others, whether they're joyful or traumatic or anything like that. However, conversation about trees is fundamentally also a conversation about land, and it's a crucial one when it comes to the particular short film I'm talking about. It's by Kenyan writer and director Wanuri Kahiu, and it's called Pumzi. The film has been explored for its Afrofuturist work by many scholars, although a central symbol in the film is like a giant tree. Henceforth, writers have focused on this fact too much. They tend to be much more interested in the film's interest in water and how water is working. So in this analysis, I'm going to place specific emphasis on the use of the tree as a symbol and as an actual physical being to kind of ground the environmental and Afrofuturist message of the story. So to contextualize the short film, I think it's really important to spend a moment considering the legacy of trees and land in Africa, especially the prominence of sacred groves and involvement in local cultures across the African continent. So much literature does exist about sacred groves, so I'm only going to give like a very brief introduction here. Sorry, back a little bit. So, according to Michael Sheridan, groves exist throughout tropical Africa and typically serve as places for rituals of initiation and sacrifice. And they usually consist of, quote, dense patches of forest and agrarian landscapes, particularly in the long arc of forest savanna transition zone from West Africa to Southern Africa, end quote. It was long believed that sacred groves and indeed most forests throughout the world were remnants of primeval pristine forests that spanned entire continents. But recently, Kathleen Morrison and other scholars have challenged this assumption by pointing out that humans have occupied these landscapes since, quote, before the Pleistocene. So there's no human free analog for paleoecology. There's no originary period against which to measure these later transformations of woodlands. Um, and so, in other words, humans and the forests have grown up together for centuries. And researchers have discovered that a lot of sacred groves are the result of human action, and many of them stand on past burial grounds, abandoned settlements, different things like that. While it should be noted that not all groves follow this format and fall in line with archaeological discoveries, there is significant accepted correlation to human activity when we're talking about like the preservation of sacred groves and their importance to communities. It has been determined that many sacred groves were planted intentionally by human beings, but over time, their stories have been told and retold, and they really represent a spiritual dwelling place, both for spirits and sometimes for the spirits of ancestors. So researchers are now doing work to show how sacred groves and the trees that grow in them are entangled within the societies that they impact. Gerard which is in community life as well as intersect, connect. So these and many around the sacred grove as a social unit, and these conceptions of the groves demonstrate the inclusion of the trees as a vital part of human communities. Um, these overtones of sacred trees and spiritual connections with trees really permeate African environmental discourse, and it could definitely be said to connect to the activism of Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai, whose Green Belt movement really tried to amplify the planting of trees throughout Africa, but in particular sought to respond to resource needs of a few specific Kenyan communities by slowing rampant desertification that's affecting much of that region. Um, so, desertification is a really long-standing issue in many parts of Africa, and it was particularly exacerbated by monoculture farming techniques that were imposed by colonial leadership, really throughout the colonial history of Africa, but in particular, 19th and 20th centuries is when we see a lot of this really surfacing and becoming a big problem. Because monoculture farming increases damage to land and depletes the soil, especially if one doesn't necessarily have the ability to take into account like the nutrient levels in the soil and the things that are going on, which traditionally colonial leadership was not the best at until they saw desertification becoming a big problem. So monoculture farming, it really significantly changed the food dynamic for a lot of African communities. The food that they produced with this type of farming was increasingly sent away, either for uses in the colonial leadership structure, or sometimes even just for export. So very little of it remained to feed a lot of the people in the actual communities. And while discussing this issue in Kenya, scholar Martin Shanguhia has shown that Kenyan communities each retaliated against these colonial farming rules in their own way. But colonial leaders would instruct farmers basically to leave certain fields fallow or to not plant anything on them for a year or two in an attempt to try to replenish some of those nutrients. Many residents would farm these plots anyway, like on the sly, uh, because their community was starving and they needed some food to reach their people. So they would use those fields that they were supposed to be leaving fallow uh, because their community just desperately needed food. Um, and these actions make it clear that food access issues that kind of started with the introduction of monoculture farming create this really vicious cycle of desertification as farmers try to utilize what little viable land they have to feed their communities. However, both the imposition of monoculture farming and these small acts of rebellion on the part of the communities um, they both serve to increase soil damage and erosion and really further endangering these communities' abilities to produce food. And all of these factors really come into play when we look at a film like Pumzi, in which the damaged landscape is really shown plainly to the viewer. So I've got a few stills from the short film, just in case people haven't seen it. It's not super well known, but it is available on YouTube if anyone wants to view it later. But short film really it depicts a speculative future in which the Third World War, which was dubbed the Water War, has left the landscape a dry, radioactive, and polluted dystopia. And throughout the film, there are a lot of images that really call back to desertified landscapes in Africa. Um, and living within like a technological community which recycles its water endlessly, the main character Asha works at what they call the Virtual Natural History Museum, and she spends a lot of her time among the last relics of the natural world, including the roots of the last tree. So while there, she discovers a soil sample with abnormally high water content and no radioactivity, which leads her to embark on a journey through the desert to plant the last seed of the mother tree, despite disapproval of her community's council. And Pumzi really constructs a direct connection between trees and memory because Asha has several dreams throughout the film of a large spread tree that, really comes up to her and inspires her to kind of take action. Her supervisors encourage her to take her dream suppressants, a clear indication, as Grace Rogers has said, that there's a perceived danger to dreaming in this fictional community, as the nostalgia may evoke like different problems for their community, which doesn't have access to that natural world anymore. However, memories of the past in which the landscape was not so utterly destroyed and trees still lived are all over the Virtual Natural History Museum. And this perceived danger actually contributes to some of the conflict of the film. When Asha tries to grow a seedling that is called the mother tree in the soil that she's found, will actually come in, destroy the museum, remove her from her job, and take her away. So this connection of nature and trees specifically to memory of the past triggers Asha to think really critically about the present and to make her own impact on the planet's future by actually setting out the coordinates of the soil sample and trying to plant her seedling of the mother tree in the ground in that location. So during her trek through the desert, Asha travels through the desert, travels through really polluted landscapes. And then she sees again the giant tree from her dreams. And when she runs to it, she finds that the trunk that she touches is just another desiccated tree corpse in a desert that contains many. So she walks a little further and then she plants her seedling and she feeds it with all of her remaining water and even collects the sweat from her own body to sustain the seedling. In the last scene, Asha dies while shading the tree with her clothing, and a tree is seen to grow up really immediately from the ground beside her. So in this scene, Grace Rogers has noted that, quote, Asha's body is literally grounded to nature through the transposition of a tree grown from the combination of water, her body, and the mother's seed. And in this moment, she does not become non-human, but rather continues to engage with human life through the ecocentric initiatives that she brought on with her dreams. So the implications of Pumzi are many. One of the most interesting in terms of thinking about arboreal stories is the altered timescale of this tree's development. So we all know that trees in real life take a long time, decades, centuries, to reach the size of the tree that I showed you on the previous slide. Yet Asha's seedling sprouts seemingly within a few minutes while she sits at her desk. And it's unclear how long she's in the desert, but by the time she plants it, it has grown considerably compared to our first glimpse of the sprout. So this alteration and really careful veiling of the timescales that are being represented is crucial to Pumzi's wake work. Much like Christina Sharp maintains in her book, which I talked about at the beginning, part of being Black in today's world is a reconciliation of past, present, and future, and a recognition that each one of these affects the others. In Pumzi, the past works immensely on Asha's perceptions of both the present and the future, and in turn, her current perceptions modify her understanding of the past as well. The point where she really strikes out on her own to reintroduce non-human nature to the desiccated world. The seedling's very quick growth cements this connection between these timescales even further and almost kind of folds them into one another. Asha's and the whole world's entanglement in this really important human-tree relationship is made clear for us to see in this film in particular. And honestly, what better symbol to express this merging of past, present, and future than a tree? Ideal representations of memory and both their functions as symbols and their physical living presence really speak through this arboreal short film. And Jane Bryce has argued that science fiction and speculative fiction have always been a part of African culture and find representation in oral traditions. Her argument for Afrofuturism in Pumzi is palpable when viewing the film. It's clear that Asha's dreams are affecting how she interprets the world and how she decides to change it. And Asha certainly has an eye for the future in this narrative, but it's important to remember that speculative and dystopian fictions have always been critiques of the present. So yes, they imagine distorted futures, but those futures are an extension of observations that writers make in the present moment. And Pumzi really speaks to the dangers of climate change, desertification, other environmental damages, and asks us to take action in the present to change our trajectory away from those desecrated landscapes. The future, or the fact that this narrative figures a tree as a main image and ecological agent is noteworthy because it extends the tree beyond the past and present and into the future, while retaining its status as a memory keeper and a purveyor of cultural knowledge. The tree in this story really signals a revitalized interest in land and its ability to nourish life, whether it's human or non-human life. The tree's inclusion in this narrative of Deadland should refocus our vision on trees in the present and foster a longer view of arboreal time to allow us to change our own futures. And the trees will always be present for us, witnessing it all. So that is what I've got. If anyone wants to see sources or anything like that, I have around 3 pages of them. But feel free at the end during question time to let me know if there are any questions about any of that.
Thank you so much, Emma. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to keep our questions, but I'll ask everyone to wait until the end after everyone has presented. And then Jared, you can go ahead and begin yours.
Perfect. All right. Everybody can see? All right. Cool. All right. So greetings. I'm Jared Grant. I'm a PhD student in agricultural and applied economics. And today I'm presenting this paper dealing with like a Bayesian trust game on successfully opening a grocery store. Okay. So this topic covers things such as food security or food accessibility. And food security focuses on the affordability of healthy foods, and food accessibility focuses on access to it. And during the pandemic, food insecurity rates actually increased, and existing policies that was geared towards combating food insecurity or low food access were deemed insufficient for a variety of reasons, including food bank shutdown or just difficulty in enrolling in food assistance programs such as SNAP, which is purchasing groceries on like through EBT cards. One paper notes that policies geared towards community-centered strategies are needed to help improve or make these issues better. And one thing about community-centered strategies is they're based upon leveraging trust within the community. So trust, and we talked about this throughout this whole conference, but trust focuses on a positive expectation of other players' actions in a mutually beneficial agreement under a realm of uncertainty. And it can be impacted by various things, including reputation, promises that are made or broken, or the concept of betrayal aversion, where if I've been hurt in the past, I don't want to be hurt again. I don't want to be in those situations. And regarding food access, suppose that a local government decides to place a grocery store in a low food access area. Thing is, if residents in this location have seen numerous grocery stores at this specific location come and go, such as close, they may not believe this current iteration of the grocery store will last. Because they don't believe it will last, they may not adopt it or frequent it as often as they probably would have in the past. Because they don't adopt and frequent it, the grocery store is not making any profits. If the grocery store is not making any profits, it's forced to close. Thus, the distrust the residents may have grows, thus creating a paradoxical cycle. So to target that specific situation, created a variation of a trust game, which is a game theoretic model that rationalizes how trust can impact consumers' economic decisions. It's been applied to various different sectors, but minimally been applied in this realm. So what I'm pretty much going to showcase today is first the game theoretical models that embeds like residential trust in like opening and maintaining a grocery store in a low income or low food access area. Then Bayesian variations, which is incomplete information games. I'm going to showcase what the entire trust prior belief distribution or how trust scores can vary the outcomes that can occur in the game. And then using actual survey data, perform what's called prior elicitation, which pretty much provides a more informative prior to understand the likelihood of successfully opening a grocery store. And pretty much overall throughout this, the goal is to like help policymakers make place-specific insight into how different food programs and food initiatives can impact opening a grocery store in a low food access area. So this is a diagram showcasing the structure of the game. So there's two players, the stakeholders and the residents. The stakeholders represent a cooperative agreement with local government and grocery store operator where they decide to open a grocery store. Their first decision is whether they want to involve an influencer or somebody that's influential to the community. Once they decide whether they want to involve them in opening the store, it then moves to the residents. The residents then decide whether they want to adopt or not adopt the grocery store, meaning frequent it and purchase groceries from the store. After some time has passed, typically when the grocery store's lease ends, they must have three choices. They can either renew the lease and maintain the store's upkeep, meaning quality produce is always being restocked, fresh fruits and vegetables, or they can renew the lease and not maintain the store's upkeep, meaning it's a more mediocre store. You may see fresh fruits not getting restocked, things of that nature, or simply just close the store. So at the bottom, you can see all the different combinations that can happen given the residents and the stakeholders' choices. So as I mentioned, this is a Bayesian variation of the game, and pretty much that means that each player has two different types. that operate under two different motivations and can have two different payoffs. So the residence two types is trust and no trust. And the difference is trust type is more likely to adopt the store than the no trust type. The stakeholders, their two types differ based upon the food assistance programs they offer. So the first one is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. This is where like people that register for SNAP or EBT cards, they can get fresh fruits and vegetables or foods at like a lower cost. Traditionally, most stores offer SNAP. Most grocery stores offer SNAP. So this is more like the traditional attempt at placing a grocery store in an area. The other one is known as the Gus Shoemaker Nutrition Incentive Grant Program, or GUSNIP. And what this program does is offer an immediate 50% discount on SNAP allowable foods. The con with this is that funding only lasts a set amount of time, and not that many grocery stores have actually done GUSNIP. So it's really relatively new. So now I'm going to break down like how the payoffs are. So the stakeholders' payoffs are in terms of profit, because that's what they focus on at the end of the lease term. And to make sure that this was realistic, I actually consulted a grocery store operator that pretty much helped me get estimates for in gross sales for how much rent or how much a restock is or refresh, in order to understand how the decisions they make when it comes to profit, and how, like, okay, like, for example, if I want to remodel the store, this accounts for 15% of my gross sales, but cost me roughly 20%. So things of that nature. For the residents' payoffs, it's in terms of utility or satisfaction. And what I did was I used like a common utility function, Cobb Douglas utility function, and weighted it by a store trust score. And what the store trust score represents is the reputation the store may have. And it can be a variety of different things, such as the numerous times that a grocery store has been placed at a specific location, and also an influencer score. If stakeholders involve an influencer, then an influencer can like boost it up. And an influencer score can be things such as number of followers the influencer may have, or just something to measure the overall impact of that influencer. Another thing is, I can't assume that the residents will frequent the store just because the stakeholders placed the store there. There was a previous grocery store that they frequented, which can affect how they could frequent this new store. So what I did was also include a frequency share, where I could purchase my groceries at Walmart, Target, and I'm trying to think of an Aldi, for example. And as long as I'm purchasing all my groceries from everything, as long as it sums to one, I'm getting all my utility from there. So for the influencer represents a conditional partner for the stakeholder. And what they do is serve as pretty much a way to compensate the distrust the residents may have towards the stakeholder or for the government. And there's been numerous examples of this occurring in literature. And probably the most famous one is former First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move Public campaign, which was geared towards combating childhood obesity through active movement. And in conjunction with it, Beyonce actually reworked one of her famous songs, Move Your Body, which was geared towards getting students to do flash dancing. And what you see is Google search data regarding from that time period. In red, you can see a huge spike when Move Your Body first started, and then you see delayed spike when you see the Let's Move campaign. This is pretty much just to signify the impact an influencer can have in making things happen. And many kids may not remember the Let's Move campaign, but they remember Move Your Body. So this just showcases that. So this showcases the game in normal form. And in normal form, like, for example, in game theory, and how it works is the residents' payoffs are always the first one, and the stakeholders' payoffs are always the second one. On the side, A represents if the residents adopt the store, DA represents do not adopt the store. And for the stakeholder, if there's an I in front of it and influencers involved, N represents no influencers involved, M represents maintained, D represents do not maintain, C represents closed. But to make things easier, I lumped everything into categories such as successful, sustainable, and unsuccessful, where a successful outcome is where the store is maintained, sustainable is where the store is not maintained, and unsuccessful is where the store closed. And a Nash equilibrium is known as an optimal outcome where both the resident and the stakeholder make the best choice and they don't deviate. So I'm gonna showcase things from the successful, sustainable, unsuccessful to make things clear, and it makes clear for me. But this is the game with complete information, meaning each player knows the other's type. So the top row represents scenarios where the residents are type trust, and the bottom one is where residents are type no trust. And what we see in highlighted is what is known as the Nash equilibrium. And in the rows where there's trust, we can see there's only one Nash equilibrium, where if I'm the snap stakeholder, my best outcome is where I don't hire an influencer and I do not maintain the store's upkeep, but and the residents adopt. Versus with the GUSNIP type, the best outcome is where I maintain the store's upkeep, no influencer, and the residents adopt. And this just showcases that because the GUSNIP can afford to have a price discount, they can afford to maintain the store, whereas a SNAP store may not be able to. When we look at the bottom row, we see the scenarios where there's no trust. And this is where it gets interesting. We see that there's two Nash equilibriums, a successful one and an unsuccessful one. The successful one is one where an influencer is hired and the store is maintained, versus for the unsuccessful one, the residents don't adopt the store, no influencer, and the store closes. And what this denotes is that in scenarios of no trust, you can see scenarios where the store is successful and unsuccessful. This can showcase the disparity we see in literature regarding why some stores work and some policies don't. So trust plays a role in that. So because I wanted to focus on, like I said, the Bayesian variation, I wanted to see what is the difference between trust and no trust for each stakeholder type. So what I did was assign a probability of alpha that because the stakeholder has no idea what the residence type is. So they assign a probability of alpha to it, essentially predicting a trust score ranging from 0 to 1. And what I did was actually visualize that trust score using violin plots, which I'm gonna show right here. So on the y-axis represents 0 to 1. So 0 represents no trust and 1 represents complete trust. And what you see is the overall density, or where the successful, sustainable, and unsuccessful outcome lie on this distribution. So for example, the SNAP one, we see that trust scores, typically successful outcome trust scores typically range between 0 and 55. And sustainable, huge range from about 15 to 1. And for unsuccessful, we can see it ranging from 0 to about 0.3. And we can see that there's clear overlap with the SNAP type. Whereas with the GUSNIP type, we see that there's clear pattern. If trust is high, it's going to be successful. If trust is low, it's going to be unsuccessful. So this pretty much showcases that and the reason why the SNAP one is like this is because the SNAP one involves hiring an influencer or involving an influencer. And because I will not hire an influencer if I already have trust being high, that is the reason why there's a big overlap. So each one has its own different rationale or motivation in order to understand how to look at the way to open a store in that area. Now, another thing I want to notice is that the shape. Usually with violin plots, there's more of a shape with it. Because this was a theoretical model and providing a framework for it, we see it being more uniform, meaning we have no idea on the likelihood of a successful outcome. Each one is equally likely. So what I do prior elicitation, which two different ways. I do variate analysis, which focuses on staying frequency analysis, which is focused based on a linear regression model. So the data I used, I did an online survey in Los Angeles metro area. I focused on like a age of 18, primary shoppers. They had to be I did it one for each stakeholder type. So there was over, after performing data cleaning, 495 observations. And in the survey, I asked questions that was geared towards, like, on a scale of 0 to 100, what is your likelihood, or like how much do you trust in like your local government's decisions, or trust in your food accessibility, or trust in the grocery store quality in your area. And then I averaged it to create a composite trust score. And the map that you see right here is the entire demographic from our survey respondents. And the darker blue areas denote areas of high trust in Los Angeles metro area, and the yellow represents low to no trust. And what we see is that trust can vary, and this is on the zip code level. Like I asked question where I asked them what their zip code was, because what we can see now is that trust can vary across zip codes, which was interesting to showcase that you can't just place a grocery store in an area like this. It depends on understanding the community. So using prior elicitation or understanding, like multiplying the likelihood that I gained from the trust scores, I use that to my theory. And now we can see a comparison between the univariate analysis, multivariate analysis to the theory. And we can see more of the likelihood of successfully opening a grocery store in Los Angeles. For example, for the multivariate analysis, you kind of get more of a feel. You can understand like how the shape is. Like it seems like trust is really high in the 50% range and slim in the sustainable. And for the unsuccessful outcome, it's primarily in the 30% range and a little bit in zero. Versus with the Gus Nip store, we can see that trust is like for the successful one and for the multivariate, it's primarily at the 75% range. Like there's very few 100% trust, which kind of reflects a little bit of reality. So it pretty much provides more shape and more nuance and understanding how to better place a grocery store in this area. But overall, in conclusion, the big thing that these results highlight is, one, maintenance of a grocery store's upkeep is important. Price for relatively healthy foods. I say relatively because it's all perspective. And the biggest thing, and this is by far the one thing that I wanted to highlight, was knowing the community that you're want to place the grocery store in. Understanding that you can't just place a grocery store in an area. You need to understand, develop, like have somebody that's involved with it and have an idea of where, like the demographic. And I know I mentioned like leveraging trust through like hiring an influencer, but really an influencer should be someone that a partnership, someone that can, you know what I'm saying? Like, because if it's just what's it called? Like a lot of fast food restaurants hire an influencer to promote their product, and then it's just for the payoff. For this to be successful long-term, viewing it as a partnership. The multivariate analysis one definitely showcased better results. And yeah, and the last thing is these results can be updated using information gained from understanding consumer behavior, local surveys, and just secondary data. But yeah, that was everything. Thank you. And I think all questions are towards the end. So yeah.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. Sorry, there we go. Can everyone see that? Can you give me a thumbs up? Cool, thank you so much. So hi everyone, my name is Jeydelyn Martinez, she, her. I'm a Master of Sustainable Peacebuilding student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I'm so grateful to have space to be in community with you all virtually and to share this presentation today. So today I'm going to talk about free school meals are foundational, but not all we need to consider. And a reason, sorry, I'm having a little tech, there we go. A reason for this, why school meals in particular, does have to do a lot with where I'm currently working as an intern. So I currently work at Food Corps. Food Corps is a nonprofit that partners with schools and communities to nourish kids' health, education, and sense of belonging. And they have a 2030 goal that every child will have access to food education and nourishing foods in schools. Food Corps also serves 250 schools and districts in 16 states in the District of Columbia. And they are huge advocates of again, food education, nourishing meals, local procurement and scratch cooking, student voice and choice, partnerships with farmers and farm to school, right? And they also have policy advocacy and leadership development initiatives like joining the White House Challenge to End Hunger and Build Healthy Communities, being a part of that, advocating for free school meals for all. and also starting professional development chapters like Food Corps alumni policy leads that will advocate for this 2030 goal, as well as establishing a group called Food Folks, which is Food Operations and Leaders of Color in School. And so in addition to this experience, what has me interested in school meals and wanting to explore more on the literature about it too was that I was a former student, right, that benefited from free or reduced lunch throughout my childhood. And also I worked as a teacher too, and kind of have seen what school meals mean, what food means in this space, and how important it is. So I do want to give a brief history about school meals because I think it's really important. So the National School Lunch Program has been around for 77 years, which that makes it the longest running child's health and welfare program in the United States. And during the pandemic, they made a historic move, right? The US made a historic move that made all meals free to all children, regardless of income, for the first time. And so the National School Lunch Program was officially instituted in 1941 during the Depression era, and Congress passed the National School Act, which is essentially the beginning of the National School Lunch Program, But what's really important is how it didn't really reach all students who needed to benefit from it, particular communities that had been historically marginalized, such as students who are Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color, right? And so it felt short, and this was especially prevalent in the 1960s, 1970s, in the period of segregation and Jim Crow policies. And so we had folks like the Committee on School Lunch Participation and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, that demanded the federal government change the National School Lunch Program to become universally free, or at the very least, create like financial benchmarkers so that if families only made a certain income, that they could get reduced or free lunch. And so the government took the latter. They did not implement universal free meals, unfortunately, but these organizations and Black liberation movements were critical to making national school lunch more accessible. And also the Black Panther Party too shaped the current school meal system by instituting free breakfast for children from 1969 through the 1970s. And even though the government was really volatile towards the Black Panther Party, as we know, and really hypercritical of these free breakfasts for children programs, it gained national attention, and it pushed them to incorporate this into school meals. And so in 1975, a government-run version of the Black Panther Party Free Breakfast for Children initiative implemented through the USDA in the school meals program. So it's important to know the roots of all of this and situate that, right? So kind of moving on into COVID era, right? Again, as I mentioned, there was a historic move through Congress that gave school waivers in 2020 to provide free breakfast and lunches to schools for children regardless of income. That was extended again in 2021-2022 school years. And then in 2021, additionally, the Universal School Meals Program Act was introduced by Senator Sanders, Representative Oman from Minnesota, Representative Moore from Wisconsin. But unfortunately, it did not move forward. It was just introduced. And had it moved forward, had it been passed, it would have permanently made free breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack to all school children, regardless of income. It would have eliminated school debt, which is a huge barrier for families and weight, and it would have strengthened local economies by incentivizing local food procurement, right? And so the waiver was set to expire in June 30th, 2022, which it did, but 5 days before that, the Keep Kids Fed Act was signed into law, and that provides additional funds for school meal programs and extends select regulatory waivers, but it prevented all schools from offering free meals to all students for the 2022-2023 school year. So what happened then? That meant that states, and most importantly, families and caregivers were left up to their own resources to get their children fed in a global pandemic still, right? and scrambling and being unprepared to submit school meal applications, especially for those it was their first time. And so I want to talk a little bit about the impacts and the benefits of free school meals before the pandemics from a few studies. So a study conducted by the University of Vermont researchers showed that it improved overall school social climate as a result of financial difference being less visible. It increased ability of schools to purchase and serve local food as well. And another systemic review by Mathematica on universal school meals in the US and other developed nations showed that they significantly increased overall student participation in school, their academic performance, and overall helped improve family security for low-income households. So I want to touch on kind of the benefits of free school meals and the challenges during the pandemic, specifically during 2021 to 2022. This is research done by the Food Research and Action Center. This was their large school district report in 2022. And so they surveyed and worked with 64 districts. And in these 64 districts, there is over 9,000 schools represented, and that served over 5 million students. So this is pretty substantial data. And so some of the challenges on the left show some operational challenges identified by school nutrition staff of, having to deal with supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, rising food prices, and low participation in meal programs still as a challenge, right? And also serving meal safety. But then on the right side, there are some benefits of a lot of benefits of free meals to all students, right? Which it reduces child hunger. It eliminates stigma associated with school meals. It supports, right? It eliminates school debt. It improves student behavior, and 58% reported it advances racial equity too. So those are really important to keep in mind. And also, just really briefly, the impacts of the end of universal school meals by the School Nutrition Association report noted that there was a significant increase in unpaid meal debt charges. For once it was clear during, the pandemic, because the federal government had implemented these waivers and cleared school meal debt, it came right back into the millions of dollars, right? And they also showed a decrease in participation in lunch and breakfast as well. So I want to just touch on quickly, where are we now nationwide with free school meals for all? So I made this graph here, and in the green, the dark green, are the states that have moved forward and made universal free school meals into permanent policy. That includes California, New Mexico, Maine, Minnesota, and Colorado. California was the first state to pass it, but these states have differences in the policies of universal free school meals and who that encompasses and what it does. In the light green, those are the states that have passed universal free school meals only for this academic year that we're in, 2022-2023, or through the 2023-2024, but with no real plans to extend it beyond that time. And then the states that are highlighted in yellow, which includes my home state, Wisconsin, are states that are recently or currently planning, drafting, discussing, or negotiating universal free school meal legislations. And the issue with this, it's great that states are moving towards this, right? This is a great initiative and needs to be done, but it would have made so much more of an impact had this been really made a permanent policy at the federal level instead of having states individually try and pass this. But this seems that this is the way that it's going right now, policy-wise. Okay, so kind of how I reviewed kind of my experience with my internship and my own studies and the literature that I reviewed. I wanted to apply systems analysis, a systems thinking lens, right, to if we did federally implement universal school meals, or at the state level, each state did it, what would that mean? What are other things that we need to consider, right, that are important? So the event would be implementing free school meals for all, right? Then we would look at patterns of behavior, structure of the system, and mental models. So first, I'll go over the patterns of behavior, and I'll only list a few here. And this is certainly not conclusive, right? These are just some themes. For example, schools would still have to deal with being short staffed, supply chain shortages, and in a fast-paced cafeteria environment that might not be so suitable for the staff and for children, right? There's also that trouble still with student engagement and wanting to participate in these programs and dealing with food waste as well. And also, you know, heat and serve food preparation, that being prioritized over scratch meal cooking, for example. Okay, and then we'll look at the structures of the system. So like the middle of the iceberg model, right? Of a big one, right? Of racism and classism. Just because stigma has decreased, implementing universal school meals doesn't mean that there isn't still issues of racism and classism in the school meal system in schools in general, right? And so, you know, it's thinking about, are we only providing foods that adhere to white dominant culture and definitions of healthy and nutritious, right? Are we giving limited culturally responsive foods that highlight the diversity and the cultures of the students in the community in those schools, and not as a one-off or one-day celebration, but into the menu, right? And in classism, are we, in these policies, are we clearing families completely of school debt, right? Wiping that out, that they do not have to pay that back and reducing that barrier? And are we making sure our school meal options are equitable, that it's not just students who are in higher income areas or in maybe private institutions that are receiving better food and better access, that's made more equitably. Another thing is, you know, the inequitable times and spaces given to children to eat. This varies from school to school, but there are some schools that sometimes only give students 30 minutes, which in the end, after they go in the line and sit down and use the restroom, it ends up being 10, 15 minutes to eat. That is not enough time for a child to eat, to enjoy their food, to be in community with one another. And so we need to think about that and those changes. And then again, you know, the bottom of the iceberg is mental models, right? Of, you know, those stigmas associated with school food they still exist, of meals, of school food isn't good and or nutritious or only caters to white American dominant culture, right? Or the fact that, you know, if we implement universal free school meals, that should be enough, right? That free is good enough, but it's not. Our children deserve more than that. They deserve to experience the power, the joy of food, as my internship site really promotes, and they deserve that space to kind of learn about food too. So kind of just to wrap up, I want to talk about just considerations, just kind of bring it all together to improve free school meals for all. So what we do is actually center students, think about student voice and choice, involving students in the food selection process and meals, right? That meals are culturally responsive and integrated into the menu. Times increase for them to eat, and the conditions of the cafeteria are improved. That's a welcoming space that children want to be in. And there's dedicated, integrated, responsive food, nutrition, wellness, racial and environmental justice education, right? How about we also empower families and release burdens, right? That financial burden, wiping out all debt, and also increasing family and caregiver and community engagement, again, as an invitation, not an obligation. What if we had local and community sourcing integrated into these policies, right? So having those partnerships with farmers and farm to school and local food organizations and entrepreneurs, especially from BIPOC and socially disadvantaged backgrounds, that we're implementing scratch cooking and incentivizing it, that these schools are able to donate foods and meals to local organizations assisting communities in need. What if we create the conditions for staff to thrive, giving them living salaries, responsive professional development and training, equitable, safe, and sustainable work conditions for them, not just nutrition and food education, but for all staff, right? And how about we also, in these policies, celebrate success and empower schools and districts to improve their meal programs through monitoring and evaluation that is responsive, through giving them the resources, training, and support to meet their goals and initiatives and be even better, right? And serve our kids. So just to conclude, when I thought about this conference of like the meaning of nourish and food and trust, these are other words and concepts that came to mind of like, we need belonging, we need a shared understanding of nourishing meals and what that means for our children. There needs to be justice, there needs anti-racism, needs to be centered in everything that we do. We need to know the history and the roots and create spaces of power and connection, right? And so that's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that presentation and for all of the presentations that we've heard on this panel. I have some, as always, thoughts and questions that arise as I heard each of you speak. But we have about 20 minutes for question and answer, so I will hold mine and see if there are any questions that you have for one another or questions for those who are able to join us in the audience today.
Well, I just want to, it's not really a question, maybe it is. To Jared, I really appreciated your presentation because I saw a lot of parallels, right, between ours of like, there's these well-intentioned initiatives, but we still need to create the conditions for them to be successful. And so I wondered in your research, did you look at like, I know in research there's a boundary and you have to draw it, but I wondered if you came across like farmers markets too, and kind of that reception to community, especially now that they're trying to integrate more SNAP benefit eligibility?
First, both y'all great presentation, but yeah, the overlap with ours. Like I liked how you mentioned like the history and like the Black Panthers and how that really appreciated that and just the overall structure of it. And you're right, like focusing on thriving, that's the main goal. Actually, what inspired to a degree this research was in conjunction with it. I've been actually volunteering with like one of my mentors as a farmer's market. So seeing how community engagement was big with him, like seeing somebody that came to the stand for the very first time, how they first skeptical or, peeping what's going on and peeping the trust. And then they come more frequently and purchase more, and him talking to them about things or like understanding and realizing like it's more of a culture. And that's, yeah. So looking at it from that point of view, also interviewing with like food banks and realizing like there's a whole relationship vibe. So yeah.
Yes, I have a question for both Jared and Jeydelyn. So first of all, really love both your presentations. They were excellent. I come to this space as a person who works in a community school here in Milwaukee. So a lot of what I do is bridge schools and families to resources. So one of the big tenets we have is nutrition and wellness. And so I guess what I'm curious about is, in your research, did you find any overlap between using schools as a central location as a bridge to accessing, in your case, grocery stores, or Jeydelyn's case, just like the free lunches? Is there sort of a place where they all meet in the middle in ways that build sustainable networks? Because the other issue that we face is just building capacity. So is there anything you found to help do that?
I guess I could take a touch on it first. I know that there was talk and papers have done studies that focused on, for example, if I have a kid, like using education and school system geared towards healthy eating and making that being homework and forcing families to like be part of it, like, hey, we have to go to the farmer's market. It really makes families like being involved and change dietary. Like if my kids have to do this, then I have to move like this way, or like, okay, we have to log what we eat for a month, or you have to eat certain things for a month. Okay, we have to purchase this from the grocery store. But overall, and even in my game, something that I didn't mean to highlight or forgot to highlight was education is really important. Educating residents that they can get a higher payoff just by adopting in the long run, like compensating distrust. So yeah, it all overworks, but yeah.
It's always a tricky thing, right? Because especially with low-income families, with families who come from marginalized backgrounds, I don't ever want to promote obligation. I'd rather promote invitation. And I know that can be difficult, but like making that space and like, I think making it more aware of like what your children are doing at school spaces, for example, and like what they're participating in, and having these family engagement events that again are invitation, to kind of see what's going on and how students are learning. And I think also that what Jared spoke to, that education piece is so crucial, right? Of like kids having access in schools, dedicated space, and like actually making food education and nutrition education and wellness education actually a priority in curriculum instead of something on the side, which often happens. And that kind of shows them that it's important and gets them excited, hopefully, and sharing that with their families. And I know in the pandemic, I mean, technically we're still in the pandemic, y'all, but in the height of the pandemic, right, schools were essential, like in supplying families with meals, with, you know, students. And so it did become that center a little bit by force. And so I think it's like thinking creatively of how we can do that again, and also building that trust of schools too, because I know there's a lot of mistrust with families with schools. So yeah, I think it's gonna take time and multiple pieces, but it is possible. I just think it's more creating those conditions, and again, those invitations instead of obligation, and like showing why it would be helpful to show up and participate. But I hesitate to put any obligation, because we don't want to further burden families who are already burdened enough. So I hope that answered a little bit.
That was good. Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah, for those who aren't familiar with my background or weren't for my presentation this morning, I'm also a teacher and work in schools. And I was speaking this morning about like chopping vegetables with children. So my brain is going all kinds of different places. And like, as you're talking, I'm imagining like, what would it look like to host a farmer's market on the playground at school? Like, you know, many schools, I worked at schools that our playground is just a big concrete lot, and like, what if we put tents up there and families were able to visit it after school or on Saturdays? Or so I'm having like all of these dreams of building, but I actually want to find let me try and talk, sorry. It's through thread through the presentations. And I'm thinking, Emma, of what you said about this desertification, and you said it was exacerbated by the monoculture, which was imposed by colonial leadership and depletes the soil. And I'm thinking about this connection here of grocery stores that have been imposed on communities that don't upkeep, then no longer having fresh food, and how that is also a form of this. And then, you know, in schools where we have imposed these menus that may not be culturally appropriate, we've imposed curriculums that have don't have nutritional or, you know, health base in them, that don't have children like actually hands-on making their own food, which in my practice as a teacher, I found is just a really helpful way to get kids willing to eat foods that they might not otherwise be willing to eat. They get very proud. You know, there's this sense of ownership and empowerment. But when we just impose something on them, right, this colonial leadership that comes down through schools and also through city planning, you know, we have this same outcome as when we have farmers' fields that only have one crop. And so I wonder if any of you are like, have a response to that, have a sense of how that might show up in your work. And feel free to take it in any direction if it sparks any thoughts for you.
Yeah, it definitely, I think what you're saying is like super related to what I was talking about, because, you know, part of the challenge, I guess, of ecological awareness and ecological work is showing people how this is relevant to their life. You know, I write about trees and people are like, well, what's the really important part about these trees? But ecosystemic health and soil health are like a big deal in terms of creating sustainable food pathways for communities no matter what that looks like. And monoculture farming is one of those things that has become really entrenched in a lot of places. We're routinely seeing government subsidized crops being kind of really put on top of the pyramid. So like corn and soybeans grown a lot because farmers see that as less of a risk than some other crops. And the problem is when you grow only corn and soybeans on a plot of land, you know, you can alternate them to try to get the soybeans to fix nitrogen back to the soil. Ultimately, like using those same crops over and over again really just depletes soil's resources. And like some of the other things that end up coming up with contemporary farming as well, like chemical fertilizers and pesticides and the different things that we're using on our crops really impact the soil as well. And one of the things that I think is really important is focusing on trees and focusing on other non-humans is a really good way to kind of create that touchstone with soil. Because I feel like often we're focused on the food when it comes off the plant, like when it goes into our grocery stores. And a lot of us, like you were saying, because we don't have those hands-on experiences with our food and growing it in that process, we don't really conceptualize how much soil has to do with the food we have access to. And so like creating those mental pathways, creating those stories and experiences that we can share with one another, and then also, you know, providing educational spaces for people to be able to like actually get their hands on the ground, so to speak, and like in there work on things and see how farming practices are impacting soil, I think is really important. Yeah.
Just to like highlight for what you said, Emma, made me think about how like if like supply chain, like how, for example, like if things aren't right with like if soil quality or if a storm hits or something along that lines hits and destroys this farm or where it starts, then it trickles down all the way to where it impacts us and where how things happen because of scarcity, price goes up. So it all everything like plays a role and everything is important. So I'm glad that you highlight that. I actually had another question regarding with schools. What's your thoughts on like school allergies? For example, and then when I was growing up, school lunch was a peanut butter jelly sandwich. I'm allergic to peanut butter, so like I can't eat that. So like in your research, what was your like thoughts on that? Well, I don't know if like it looked at that.
So I didn't personally do a deep dive in that because I have to draw a boundary, but definitely something I was cognizant of and aware of. And so I think this is where schools should feel empowered to be able to make choices that cater to their students' needs. And so this is again with like student needs, student voice, student choice of like who are our students, who do they represent demographically, like how can we be more culturally responsive and like fit their needs to allergies, right? And so I think it is a delicate balance, right? Because that goes into like, are we creating the conditions for staff to thrive in school cafeteria to be able to cater to students' needs and desires in school meals and have it be an experience that isn't unsafe or scary or not enjoyable. And so I think, again, it's like those condition creating and also knowing in particular schools, what are the needs? Like there can be, and there are in schools, right? There's a general, like, this is what we don't serve because this is a big allergen. But what are other creative things that we can serve? What are things that we can locally source and put into our menus? And what are things that we can have our students taste? And again, back to Emma's point and also Amber's of like starting from the beginning, like it's crazy to me some of the things I'm finding out as an adult of where food comes from, like simple things, like it feels silly to say, but I literally did not know cinnamon came from a cinnamon tree. Do you know, things like that? But if we had that education, like from the start of like children being involved in gardens, meeting with farmers or being in a farm to school, having that education, growing, picking those vegetables, trying them, saying, I like this, I don't like this, then seeing it on the menu. It's this whole like systems change, right? And so it's a lot of work that we need to do, but it's important work. And I'm just glad, like in this space, how it's so connected and how that those threads are just showing up.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Thank you.
I just want to jump, I'll try and keep it very brief as I know we only have 5 minutes and I want to make space for others to speak too. But I just wanted to jump in on that question because I'm an allergy mom. So my daughter has a severe dairy and soy allergy, just like to the point she had to have a feeding tube and a hospital stay. It was a whole thing. But then I'm also have like worked as a cook in educational settings. I've been a teacher and an administrator. So I've sort of seen this like allergy thing from all sides. And I think it comes back to this theme of trust, right? So as a parent, can you trust the school is going to give your child foods that are safe for them? And I've gotten into like arguments with other people who work in schools too of like, oh, well, like, how could we possibly monitor, whether or not the kids are getting these foods in the cafeteria? And I think that kind of comes back to your presentation about like, well, what if we take it like another step back? What kind of experience are our students having with food if they're in a cafeteria that is so busy, so understaffed, have no time, that a staff member can't even know whether or not a child has an allergy and monitor the food that they have? Like, what if we imagine places where children are in relationship and child staff ratios are, at a safe level where, obviously that's going to help children who have allergens or dietary restrictions. But then also all children are going to be in this like more joyous, slow paced, enjoying the food. And then we can expand our view of like what kinds of foods are safe and appropriate to think about cultural safety too. So I just wanted to add that in there as some thoughts to chew on. And then we have like 3 minutes left if people have other questions or responses too.
I mean, I think it's also important to note like policies play in this, and the Farm Bill is coming up this year, right? So this impacts all that we talked about, and how that changes, and how farmers are incentivized to have a diversity of crops, to use more sustainable practices, and also to be able to form partnerships with community and schools. So just to throw that out there, but like it's just a piece in this huge system. But I guess it's just, for me, it's just like considering where we enter in the system and how we can kind of promote and uplift those pieces so it kind of all works together to change, I think is crucial.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I would say it's also like really important for us to start considering alternative farming options. Because one of the things that I've encountered a lot in my research, I mean, the whole sustainable agriculture internship on Washington Island, we focused on like alternatives to monoculture farming. So for example, agroforestry was a really interesting one where you're growing like basically a forest. In the forest are your crops. And silvopasture was another one where you have like animals like sheep or something like that that are actually grazing in a forest. And so like exploring some of those different options and being a little bit more willing to take a look at the whole system and figure out like where we could fit in alternative solutions that will work for everyone and might actually be easier than like buying chemical fertilizer and doing all the work of like getting those chemicals where they need to be, I think is a really important thing to think about as well.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to like the intention to move towards more food sovereignty for people, right? And that the system has worked against that and has made us rely on the way that food is processed and disseminated and shown to us today. And so how can we learn more about those practices, even things like community gardens, right? in your own home to be able to contribute and do this reimagining, right? Because it doesn't have to be this way. It was made this way, but we can change it.
Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect thought to close out on. So in just a second here, I'll go ahead and end this Zoom meeting. And then for those of you who will be joining in for the next session, we'll start that again in just 15 minutes so I can get the next few presenters set up through their tech check. So thank you so much, everyone. And I hope to see you very soon.